The Reception of Catholic Devotional Literature by English Protestants to 1700. This paper aims to call into question two fairly common assumptions about the ways in which English Protestants engaged with Catholic literature during the early modern period. The first is that Catholic literature was only of interest either to nominal Protestants or to Protestant polemicists, and the second is that Protestant adaptations of Catholic works can be dismissed as textual piracy. I'd like to start by introducing two works. The first is The Parable of the Pilgrim by Bishop Simon Patrick. In 1717, Lawrence Howell, a Jacobite nonjurant, prefaced his translation of a work by the Catalan monk Miguel de Comalada with the following words. Dr. Patrick took his pilgrim from it. In fact, this accusation is false. Patrick's text is not based on Comalada's. As Patrick makes clear in his preface to the work, it is based on a short passage from Sancta Sophia, written by the Benedictine Augustine Baker. Baker, in turn, makes it clear that he has taken the tale from Walter Hilton's Ladder of Perfection. Hilton, via Baker, is the true source of Patrick's text. I'll come back to this work in a moment. The second work I would like to draw attention to is Contemplations of the State of Man, purportedly a posthumous work by Jeremy Taylor. In 1848, Edward Churton demonstrated that this work was not by Taylor at all. It was, in fact, a disguised and abridged version of a Catholic translation of a work by a Jesuit writer, Juan Eusebio Nierenberg, published in English in 1672, 5 years after Taylor's death. In both these cases, the attribution of textual piracy from a Catholic source is false. Nevertheless, both writers did adapt and draw on Catholic sources. Patrick did indeed use a Catholic source for his text, even if it was not the one that Howell accuses him of using. And there are strong indications that he was more generally familiar with Catholic writers, particularly with Teresa of Avila. Taylor, meanwhile, was also well read in Catholic literature and had almost certainly read Nierenberg's work in the original Spanish. So there was considerable plausibility to both accusations. The Catholic sources of Patrick's Pilgrim, both real and imagined, are largely ignored by modern scholarship, and Contemplations is more often cited as an original work by Taylor or as a translation by him than as the put-up job that Churton demonstrated it to be over 150 years ago. This apparent lack of interest in setting the record straight with regard to these two works is symptomatic of a wider neglect. Despite the tremendous revaluation of the continuance of Catholic culture and belief in post-Reformation England, its relationship to Protestant culture is still perceived almost entirely in terms of hostility and opposition. The Protestant reception of Catholic literature is subsumed within a larger narrative of Catholicism as the antithesis of everything the good Protestant stands for. But this narrative can sometimes obscure our understanding of what was actually going on. Let me give an example of what I mean from the work of Theodore Bozeman, who is one of the few critics who actually attempts to give a balanced account of this situation. Bozeman says, Recusant translators and editors intended their works to serve English Catholics, but they also hoped to influence Protestants. By making available a rich literature steeped in Catholic religious ideals, they aimed to contribute to the reconversion of the English people. Yet the currency of such books in Elizabethan and early Stuart times, together with the dismal failure of the Counter-Reformation in England, suggests that their primary effect was to strengthen Protestant resources. And this talk of Catholic literature strengthening Protestant resources looks like a new narrative, a narrative of Catholic literature failing in its intended purpose of enticing those weak in the Reformed faith back to Rome and actually serving the Protestant interest. But Bozeman goes on to say, with specific reference to works by Parsons, Granada, and Loate, the Puritan editors of Rogers's 7 treatises and the author himself saw the work as inspired in part by the dangers of Catholic spiritual literature, and were back again there with the usual narrative of opposition. Now, this perception of Catholic literature galvanizing Protestants to write their own treatises of devotion is based on a comment in the preface to Richard Rogers's 7 treatises. Read it, Egerton says, and thou shalt find more true light and direction to a true devout and holy life than in all the resolutions of the Jesuitical Father Parsons, Meditations of Friar Granitensis, or any popish directories whatsoever. That's Father Parsons being Robert Parsons or Persons, and Friar Granitensis at Luis de Granada. Rogers makes a similar comment himself, and there's another comment of the same ilk by the Protestant convert Richard Sheldon. But how much weight should we be giving to these sources? Egerton and Rogers obviously had a vested interest here, and Sheldon is remembered mostly for making such ridiculously overstated claims about the diabolical Catholics that, as Alexandra Walsham says, he spelled his own professional suicide. Parsons was basically a controversialist, so naturally reactions were somewhat mixed. But Protestant adaptations of Luis de Granada's writings were in fact very well received and went through dozens of editions. In fact, 17th century Protestant reactions to Luis de Granada were almost entirely favourable, and his influence can be traced in, among others, Francis Mears, John Donne, Henry Vaughan, and Thomas Browne. Surely this is the prevailing narrative of the Protestant response to Luis de Granada, and Rogers, Egerton, and Sheldon are the exceptions. And Luis de Granada is not an isolated example. Other Catholics, such as Diego de Estella, Bernard of Clairvaux, Jeremias Drexel, Francis de Sales, Gerson, A Kempis, Tauler, Ferris, these were also generally well received, and one could make similar lists of the Protestant reception of these writers in England at that time. Now, one name from this list stands out. Whereas most Protestant writers make only passing reference to Catholic sources, Francis Trigg cites Luis de Granada, Diego de Estella, and other Catholic authors dozens of times, saying, "As St. Paul also had some friends in Caesar's house, now hath the gospel some friends among the Pope's train, and that in no small matters." He bemoans the fact that they are working for the other side, but nevertheless maintains that in the principal points of religion they join hands with us, exclaiming at one point of Luis de Granada that "I would to God these meditations could sink into our hearts." It's probably worth pointing out that Trigg was a committed reformist with strong Puritan credentials. Wood says he was a very strict Puritan in his time, and he passionately defended the achievements of the Reformation in England and maintained the Reformation tradition of anti-Catholic polemic, according to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. Now, if that seems confusing in light of the fact that he entitled his work The True Catholic, it's only because modern scholarship frequently fails to observe the distinction made by many early modern Protestants between Catholic and Papist. Trigg's polemic would have been against the latter, not the former. His True Catholic was fairly well received in its day and is mentioned by, among others, William Prynne. Prynne cites a section of some 17 pages from Trigg, which happened to be almost entirely based on Luis de Granada. I hope these examples make it clear that Catholic literature was not just a temptation for wavering reformists, but made an impact on committed Protestants, and not merely as fodder for polemical attacks.